Hi everyone, welcome to my presentation. Today we're going to cover chapters 3, 4, and 5 of the Project-Based Learning Field Guide. So I'll just do a little summary of each chapter as we go through these slides. Let's get started. So to start out, first we read chapter 3 titled Imagine the Possibilities. So to summarize this chapter in a sentence, it essentially helps you establish the framework for your project that you're going to create. So it kind of goes through the main ideas, kind of the checklist, what you have to go through to help create a good project. So first section of this chapter was what is most important. And it actually ties into the next section, which is what is the big idea. So the whole point of these two sections is you want to establish what is the big idea of the project. What's the main learning goal for the students to get out of the project, whatever it may be. So you want to establish that first because everything else will be dependent on what this is. So next up, the chapter covered planning for rigor, or the toughness of the project, right? So how will students develop certain skills through this project? What will those skills be? Will they be able to analyze, evaluate, and create? What will they analyze, evaluate, and create? So it really dives into detail about that. And next section is digital literacies. So what digital skills does this project address? Will it help students in their future when they're going to for their digital skills? How will it help them? This section also talks about how will this project help kids be lifelong learners, right? That's one goal for many teachers. How will this project address that? What can you incorporate into the project to address this? Also, it goes over the idea of you want your students to be info artists, ability to learn, interpret, and judge informations digitally, right? Is it a valuable source? Is it a positive source, negative source? Can they rely a reliable source? So it kind of goes over that idea. Then after this, it covers the idea of learning dispositions. So learning dispositions are kind of the ideas of like confidence, curiosity, resourcefulness. So skills you can't necessarily teach. However, you can form activities that help students learn it, right? So if you have a difficult project for the students, they can learn idea of like perseverance, hard work, then gain confidence once they've realized they can do something difficult. So that kind of idea. And then next section is keep the students in mind when you're planning these projects, right? Like, why should they care? They're coming to class, they didn't see the effort you put in, so why should they care about this project? Will it spark their curiosity? So obviously we need the students to be interested in the project. What can you incorporate into the project that will make them interested, right? Rather than just another day at school. What will help the students remember this project and really take in what they've learned? And then this chapter ends with kind of essential learning functions with digital tools. So the idea that our world is changing and technology is always changing, but if we can have these kind of 6 learning functions always with us, then it will help us take on the new information, new technology coming at us. So the 6 that it listed are research, make ideas visible, collaboration, project management, reflection, supported study. So those can apply to the students and the teachers, but those are just kind of 6 things to keep in mind when forming the framework for your project. So to move on to chapter 4, titled Strategies for Discovery. So the kind of idea of this chapter is selecting and designing projects. And which one do you want to do? Do you want to use a project from a teacher that's already created it, or do you want to create your own? I think definitely both have their pros and cons. So first section of this chapter is reviewing projects. So when you are reviewing a project to use that's been created by another teacher, you want to make sure it's quality, right? Make sure they put time into it, because if it appears that you or that teacher didn't put time into it, the kids likely won't put time into it either. They won't care. So make sure it's a quality and it came from a primary source, good source. Just overall a well done project. Another thing this section talks about is how this can be a good activity for colleagues to do who are kind of new to project-based learning. So by dissecting these projects, other people's projects, you and your colleagues can learn more about project-based learning, learn what works, learn what doesn't, and what goes into these projects. Next section after this is overcoming pitfalls. So this kind of talks about common pitfalls in projects for project-based learning. So the book gave a whole list of them. I just kind of condensed it into my own list that I thought was important from the book. So, for example, projects that don't work are long activities that are short on outcome. So, if it's long activities, kids will likely or students will likely lose interest. And if it's short on outcome, they're not going to be interested because you need a big outcome to work towards. What are they going to work towards if it's not a big outcome, right? If it's not something meaningful or important. The next one is kind of technology using too much of a traditional practice. So this idea is that you're just putting technology into the project, just have it there. You got to be original with the technology. And kind of the last one I wrote down is, or the last pitfall I wrote down, which I think is one of the more important ones, is like an overly scripted project, too many steps. So this is an issue for a couple different reasons. One being that too many steps, kids will get lost. But also, if there's too many steps, it won't allow the kids to think critically. Critical thinking is a really important skill for all kids, for life in general. So we want to make sure our projects incorporate this. So the section after this is designing projects. So to get started, first thing you want to look at is where do people get their project ideas? And I'll cover this kind of more down in the where project ideas come from section. But a big part of this is being flexible, right? The whole idea is you want to spark your students' interest through these projects. So form projects based around your students' interest, right? What interests them, and form a project around that. Section after this is best projects and most important features. So what are the features of good projects? So kind of one of them is possessing differentiating learning paths. It's very realistic. Project reaches beyond the school to involve others. So like I gave the wiki example earlier that reached beyond the classroom, even into grandparents and parents were adding to the wiki for names, right? So if kids can see the project applies to the real world and it's beyond the classroom, the learning may stick a little bit better. Another part of a good project or aspect is that you use primary sources, right? It kind of goes back to if it's quality information, the students are more likely to put some more work in if they see that what you've done is good stuff. And the last thing is students tend to learn by doing, right? So make sure it's very hands-on project. The kids are doing most of it. Because after all, at least for me, I retain information best when I am doing the project itself, not just watching someone do it for me. And then to that last section that I talked a little about earlier is where project ideas come from. So, and the kind of ideas that can come from anywhere, right? So the book used an example of how one teacher used MP3 players or music players to form a project, right? That was an annoyance in class for her, but students were interested, so she made a project around it so they could better relate to it, per se. And there's whole sorts of examples in the book. That's just a couple. But all in all, so that's kind of the summary of this chapter. Again, it just covers selecting and designing projects. So now we're on to chapter 5, titled Making Meaningful Assessment. So this chapter kind of covers the idea of assessing our students' projects. So, and it starts out by covering the topic that project-based learning is not going to have that black and white multiple choice style grading that most things do, right? It's different learning styles, so a different grading style. So the first section of this chapter is titled Authentic Assessments and Project-Based Learning, and it really covers two important questions that all our project must have that we must consider as teachers. So what do we want students to know, and how will we know when they have achieved learning goals? So after it kind of states this, it moves on to the two types of assessment, two routes we can take. So we can take the summative route, which is the end of project grading or assessment, or the more formative assessment route, which is kind of along the way. So it breaks down each, and we'll kind of look at summative first. So summative route is kind of more, you might use the idea of a school-wide rubric, focus on some core values, maybe some of those key dispositions we talked about earlier, how did the students use critical thinking skills, confidence, etc. One thing that's important with this route is that you make your intentions or your goals for your students clear in the assignment description beforehand. So I know the book gives one example about how a teacher created a short story assignment for her students. And in the assignment description, she says stuff like your story must have a clear and compelling conflict, you must use action words, etc. So the students at least know what's expected of them, so they're not surprised at the end when their story gets graded. And then when you build rubrics for the summative assessment, you can kind of maybe break it up into categories. So one example in the book is breaks it up into 3 categories of knowledge, skills, and dispositions, and then have subcategories for each. So then to move on to formative assessments, the along the way stuff. So ways you can do this is have like a project timeline, maybe set some milestones. Also a good route to take is plan for individual check-ins with students. This is good because some students might get lost, especially if it's a long project, multiple weeks. Students will get lost, and if they've got lost, you can point them in the right direction, so it's not a complete wash. You can incorporate student reflection for as like an assessment, right? So maybe use an exit slip, just so the students are at least reflecting on themselves, which is a good life skill in general, and it'll help improve their projects. Then the book goes on to give some kind of examples of stuff to use with formative assessment. So like I said, exit slips, brainstorms, project logs, checklists, all this stuff that helps students go step by step through the project without getting lost. So that's kind of it for chapter 5. Again, just talks about how we can assess our students' projects. So that's actually all I have for you guys today. Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned a bit more about project-based learning.